So I'm here to talk about the COVID economy, and as everyone knows, things have been very difficult. I think there's been a lot of transition for lots of organizations, and I'm here to kind of talk about what the Minneapolis Fed is doing to try to track that economy. Before I get too far into my presentation, I just have to let you know that the views here are that I express are my views, the data that I gathered, any interpretations of it, and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. I always feel like I should come up with another tagline like uh, expressed written consent of Major League Baseball or something like that. But so today's talk, I'm going to talk about the data challenge that we're under right now in terms of the Minneapolis Fed and trying to track the real-time economy right now. One of the ways we're doing that is we're getting a lot of we're taking a lot of pulses via surveys. Those surveys, generally speaking, we're finding very poor conditions. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. But what we are finding is a little bit more granularly. They're less bad in some places, in some sectors, and with some types of ownerships. I also want to talk about the workforce effects because those have not been evenly distributed. And there are also a lot of new measures. One of the things the Minneapolis Fed is really trying to do is swim upstream. A lot of the measures that we have traditionally used, which I'll talk about, are very time lagged. So we're trying to find out new ways of figuring out where the economy is going. And then, as I mentioned, while I have this group of business folks, I want to know what you think about the economy right now, how your firms are performing. So I have an interactive survey that I've interspersed some questions. So as we go, I'll be able to get a little bit of a pulse from you about how you see the economy. And the beauty of it is you'll actually get to see all the results as well. So there's some information some additional information that you'll be able to take away as well. So in order to do that interactive survey, I need you to get logged on to the software that I use. This is via cell phone, but we don't harvest any numbers or do anything else like that. So this is completely anonymous. So I need you to get your phone. I'm going to walk you through these steps, and I believe they're going to put a few of these instructions in the chat box. So if anyone has trouble, you'll be able to look at that chat box for additional directions. So get your phone. You're going to send a text. Let me get my pointer here quick. So you're going to send a text to the person that is 22333. And in the text box, you're going to text the word Minneapolis. If it capitalizes, that's just fine. Then hit send. And after you send that text, you're going to watch for a message. There's going to be a little pop-up box that says, you've just joined Regional Outreach Survey, something like that. Brent, if you could maybe give me a hi sign, seeing as I can't see anyone in any faces. If you could give me a verbal hi sign that folks are actually getting logged in, that would be great. If the folks that are watching, if you could maybe give a hand signal that you are logged in to the survey, that would be great. That way we know that this is working. And you may be inclined to, once you get the pop-up box, to hit that hypertext link that's in there. Please don't. Just stay in text mode for the survey questions themselves. The first one won't be for another 15 slides, but all of the questions are going to be in text mode. All you're going to do is hit a letter and hit send for a multiple choice question. So how are we getting any signals that people are getting logged on?
Yes, I think people are logging in.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So if we have those directions also in the chat box, I'm going to move forward. If you're having any difficulty, you can continue doing this while I move forward. Okay, so first I want to talk about the data challenge of a COVID economy. The chart you have here in front of you is gross domestic product, essentially output. And before COVID, this is kind of the best whole measure that we had for growth in the economy, both at the US level and at the state level and at the metropolitan level. And what I wanted to point out is that this is the most recent data that we have. So here you can see that we do have the first quarter for the US, and you see that small dip, about 5%. In the first quarter. But remember, COVID only really took hold in March, really even the last half of March as economies went into shelter in place. But at the state level, we don't even have that measure yet. So the data that we have for output at the state level is 6 months old. So obviously in this environment, that particular measure is particularly is really out of date and not useful to what's happening in the US and the state economy. The challenge is that the speed of the pandemic has made real-time information really critical, and our data systems are not particularly aligned with that need. Most of the macro data, I'll show some additional data later on employment. It just isn't as relevant as it used to be. So we're starting to fill that gap by asking the experts, and that's business people, people like you who are in the economy every day. You're running a business, you're understanding how your business is affected, and the more people we can ask, the better idea we get, at least as a fill-in, about how the Minnesota economy is working. Since, excuse me, since mid-March, I've conducted 7 surveys through mid-May. And I've done so by partnering with outside organizations, including the Minneapolis Regional Chamber of Commerce, other chambers of commerce, organizations across a 6-state region. For those that are not familiar with the Federal Reserve, with the 9th District, it runs roughly the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Western Wisconsin, and then Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Montana. And I have partners in all of those states that essentially help me get these surveys into the hands of business people. Over those 7 surveys in 2 months, we've gotten 6,500 responses from businesses, including 20,000 open comments. Businesses have really been interested in sharing their story with us, and we've read those comments, and it really helps us get a kind of a more emotional and kind of granular feel on how businesses are performing. So I'm going to describe three different surveys very quickly. The one that I'll talk about most is the one that I've conducted across the 9th District. Again, that territory that I described. The most recent one, I've done that survey 3 times, and the most recent one was in May, and I got 1,100 responses to that. I've also done a Minnesota-only construction survey. I've done that survey 3 times. The most recent one in mid-May, and I have over 500 responses to that one. And then I also did a Minnesota only, excuse me for the typo that I see there, Minnesota only survey of minority, women, and veteran-owned businesses. We did that in mid-April to get a better idea of how ownership was, traits were indicative of how you were performing in the COVID economy. And we had almost 800 responses to that. So with all of that data, there's lots of ways to get an idea of who's impacted and to what degree. What I'm going to tell you mostly about is our firm traits. How do different traits of a firm suggest how the economy is performing overall? I'm going to tell you about geographic differences. I'm going to tell you about differences via sector, size, and then firm ownership. So the first one I want to talk about is by geography. I think that's how a lot of people kind of associate how the economy is performing is by state. So we asked this question about sales and revenue in April 2020 versus April 19, and we asked firms in May to report this. And basically what you see, the darker the red, the worse the performance. Here we have lower by 75% or more in terms of sales revenue 2020 to 2019. And then lower by 50 to 75, lower by 25 to 50. So essentially what we're saying is this is really high level of impact. And what you see is South Dakota has performed better from a geographic standpoint, firms in South Dakota. But if we were to just simply look at South Dakota without the rest of the states, we would say this is a catastrophic outcome. So even South Dakota has been very dramatically impacted, but it's been impacted less than firms reporting in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Greater Minnesota, the Twin Cities, and Wisconsin. Now, so geography does matter because of state level business restrictions, but I'm going to show you some additional slides that kind of slice the data a little bit different, that geography actually matters less than this chart suggests. And that's because we asked firms to report on a couple of different levels. So we asked them to tell us what particular industry sector they were in. And what you see is that every industry sector, again, has been impacted. But what you don't see, what you do see from this is that different sectors have been influenced or affected differently. And those that are consumer intensive businesses, those that rely on crowds or face-to-face interactions, Sectors like entertainment, food and lodging, retail, those are the firms that have been the hardest hit. Not surprising when we had the shelter in place and non-essential businesses were essentially forced to close. A lot of those, I think, understandably, are seeing much stronger effects. So if you go back to the previous chart regarding South Dakota's performance, part of the reason they performed better, again, only in this survey, is because I had more firms in sectors that weren't as negatively affected, particularly manufacturing and banking, report from South Dakota. So along with another measure that I'll tell you, if you were to take some of this geographic results and weight them accordingly, you would see some compression in those results. The other thing we looked at was size, firm size. So here you have a measure of number of FTE employees by respondent. And what you can see is that size really matters. Small sole proprietorships, those that are small under 10 FTEs, saw a much more negative impact on their April 2020 revenues compared to last year. So size is inversely related. So the larger the size, the smaller the impact on April 2020 revenues. Sole proprietors, 70% have seen revenues cut in half. For the largest firms, 25% have seen revenues cut in half. Now that's still dramatic. This is still a very dramatic impact on these firms, but it's less than what you see at this level. So we also looked at COVID impact by ownership. So I did an April survey, as I alluded to earlier. In April, we surveyed minority, women, and veteran-owned businesses, got about 800 responses. And what you see is that almost 90% have seen some negative impact to their revenues in April. The question was a little different back then. I asked them to compare April revenue to essentially pre-virus levels. But again, we're seeing roughly the same impact, actually a steeper impact among these firms. 90% have seen some negative impact. Roughly 60% have seen revenues cut in half. So then what I also did from that is I included a question in the district-wide survey, which is the one that I had been talking about previously. I included an additional question for firms to identify by ownership. And what you can see is, again, roughly similar results in the sense that there's really steep impact across all ownership levels, but there's also a very clear advantage to those that were none of the above in terms of disadvantaged ownership and disadvantaged firms and their ownership.
Hey, Ron.
Yes, please.
Where in these categories, if at all, do nonprofits fit in, or are they not part of this?
They are, I would have to go back. Let me go back real quick. As a matter of fact, that's a really interesting question. I'll have to go back. I was really quite sure I had nonprofits in this, and now that I don't see it in that chart, I'm happy to follow up. We did get nonprofits in. I may have taken them out as too small of a share in the actual response. So I will have to get back to you on that question. Okay, so starting from here, again, so you see results that where none of the above ownership, so essentially what we're kind of assuming is a white ownership, is that they performed better in terms of loss of revenue. But if you take a look, again, you splice the data a little bit different, there are some reasons why some of the disadvantaged firms and their performance is influenced by the types of firms that they are. So if you go back to what we talked about earlier about how firm size affected revenue, that's kind of what you see here, is that, for example, women-owned firms tended to be smaller. So again, kind of comparing the two, the fact that women-owned businesses tended to be smaller, along with minority-owned and veteran-owned, we would expect those firms to have suffered a little bit more in terms of their revenue all other things equal. Now, I don't think things would be exactly the same. In fact, they might still be significantly different, but I think you would again see some compression in the results when you factor for some of these other methods. The other thing, if you also look at things like higher shares of food and lodging and retail businesses among these types of firms, that's another reason why you would see some compression if you were to weight all of those factors. Again, I don't think that they would be equal, but I think you'd see some compression in those results. So now I'm interested in knowing what's happened since early May. So the surveys that I've done have not been done since early May. So I'm interested in getting your feedback about what's happened since then. So here's that first question, and I apologize. The software that I'm using is called Poll Everywhere, and for some reason I am not, I'm working with them to fix this problem, but I can't help this. So I'm gonna read the question, and then I'm gonna go over the individual response options, and then all you have to do is hit a letter and hit send, and you'll see results start to pop up. So how would you describe recent sales activity at your firm compared with business activity in April, early May? So essentially since then, how have you seen business activity? Is it A, up significantly, B, up some, C, flat or unchanged, D, down some, or E, down significantly? Or if you don't know, F. And if, Brent, if there are any questions too, during any of these questions, I'd be happy to take questions if they happen to pop in while we're waiting for some of these results to come in.
Sounds good.
And it's been interesting. I'll talk a little bit about other webinars I've done and some of the other results I've gotten. For the most part, it seems like they've been rather, I don't want to call it scattershot, but as the volatility of COVID would probably suggest, there's really uneven experiences among firms in terms of what's happened. You know, you have the reopening in most states, including in Minnesota, but in Minnesota, a lot of it was delayed compared to other states. Certain sectors are performing differently. I see different results among construction groups that I've given this presentation to. And here it looks like, for the most part, probably, you know, flat, unchanged being the strongest, and then actually down is outweighing up right now. And I will be happy to share these results after the presentation itself as well. So now I'm interested in future business. So what are your expectations over the course of the summer compared to right now? Do you expect things to be significantly lower over the summer? A, moderately lower over the summer? Modestly lower. I'm really interested in more gradients here. Modestly lower is C, flat or unchanged, higher by any amount. And in the chat box, if anyone's interested, particularly with regards to Outlook, we're very interested in what businesses see going forward. So if at any point during my presentation, if you want to offer comments to things that you're seeing in the surveys, or you want to offer an explanation onto what you think in terms of Outlook or other things that we're going to talk about, I would love any additional chat that folks would be able to provide in terms of insight. And here, I think pretty positive. Getting close to half see things getting better. Unfortunately, it looks like it's relatively balanced, maybe even a little bit more that see things lower. Again, looks like there's a lot of volatility that people see, different outcomes for probably different kinds of businesses. So now I'd like to talk about Minnesota's workforce. We've talked about firms so far. Obviously, I think everyone knows that there's been a lot of unemployment, a lot of people laid off in this environment. What you have here is a chart that tracks unemployment by April. And again, I'll point out, this is the most current data we have at the state level is April, and here we are in mid-June. So it's not particularly helpful because lots of things have changed, but I want to give you just a general idea of what's been happening. Here you have the steady trundling down of unemployment after the Great Recession, and in 1 month, okay, we've seen this happen. Now there's a lot of variation between the district states that I've showed here. You have Michigan roughly at 22%, you have Minnesota at 8% for April. The US and Wisconsin are creeping up towards 15%. I don't think Minnesota's done that much better. And in fact, in some ways, I could show you evidence that it's done worse in terms of initial unemployment claims, which I'll be discussing shortly. I think what has more happened is that we have data systems that have not been able to react as quickly as the layoffs have happened. So I think there's some methodology issues that have allowed Minnesota to post what I think is probably an artificially low rate in in April. I'm expecting either a revision to the April number or a significantly larger move higher in May than you might see in some of the other states. One of the other things you hear a lot about are unemployment insurance claims. So here we have two measures. We have initial claims, which are the blue bars, and we saw levels skyrocket to levels that literally made me gasp when they first came out. Luckily, they've been falling, but even at this level, this is the most recent one at the end of May, it's still roughly 6 times the level that we were seeing leading into COVID. And typically you see initial claims falling because we're entering a period that traditionally sees stronger hiring. Okay, so they're still very, very elevated. What's interesting though is they have not necessarily led to the same effect in continuing claims. Essentially, those are the continuing claims are those that apply and are actually accepted into unemployment and start receiving benefits. And what you see is you see the same skyrocket, but then you see a leveling off, and we've even seen a small decline since the peak here at about 425, okay, roughly at about 400,000. But since mid-March, there have actually been over 700,000 initial claims. So not everybody going into the system and everyone that's applying, not everybody is actually receiving unemployment right now. And basically what it suggests is that many who are not who file are not receiving benefits for a variety of reasons. A couple easy ones are not everybody meets the requirements to receive unemployment. The other thing is we also had the payroll protection program go into place where lots of businesses received money to essentially keep their workforces. Some had to actually bring workers back as a result of that, and we think that's also part of what's happening with this trend right here. So we also asked in our surveys, what's happening to your workforce? And what you're seeing is that lots of firms are laying off workers. Some sectors are bearing a much bigger burden on this. And if you go back to some of the revenue charts that I showed you, it's not surprising that those that saw the biggest negative effects in revenue are also those firms that are seeing the biggest workforce cuts. So in food and lodging, retail, entertainment, those firms have seen more than half have done some laying off. So now I'm curious, again, we're a month away from when I asked the last time. I'm curious about what's happened at your business with regard to staffing. So if you could grab your phones again. So what best describes staffing levels or actions at your firm over the last month, roughly the last month? So are you trying to hire or add net headcount? Are you trying to hire? A. Is there no change? B. Or are you cutting workers? C. Or don't know? D. You know, we're kind of hoping that as the Minnesota economy opens, that things are going to, you know, continue on an upward track. We know it's probably not a fast growing track, but even, you know, even staying on the net positive side is a better sign than the alternative, I guess. And it looks like on balance, there's positive, but I would not call it a strong positive signal in terms of workforce. I'll wait just a little bit longer for maybe a couple last entries. Okay, moving on. Now we're also interested in wages because it's a leading indicator for us for inflation. And given the volatility, lots of layoffs, we're very interested. There's a lot of different dynamics going on in terms of wages. So I'm curious what's happened to average wages at your firm since the onset of COVID-19. The first option, oh, hang on, activate, let's try that. Okay, there we go. So if you if you pushed a letter, and I'm not seeing any, there we go. So if it's decreased by more than 25%, decrease by 10 to 25%, decrease of up to 10%, flat or no change is D, wages have increased and by any amount. So I was doing, I don't want to influence any answers. I happen to be in giving a presentation to a construction group yesterday, and I was frankly a little shocked to see that virtually all of the answers came at flat or that they have increased, which was really kind of a surprise to me because there's been a slowdown in construction in terms of pipelines, in terms of the number of projects that they have scheduled, seen a fair number of cancellations, but apparently there's still enough work that's kind of getting pulled forward that there's still a really strong demand for labor, and wages there have still held very steady.
Hey, Ron, while these are
Yeah.
coming in, as far as how you're able to share this post-webinar, are you
Yeah.
going to do that in a summary form or these actual slides? And then can you give any sense of comparison to recent surveys that has answered similar questions?
Yeah, well, I offered I guess first, what I will do is I will have, I can't, these results don't embed in the PowerPoint itself, so I will be producing a little bit of a more summary report that'll give, that'll basically give this visual. It would also give by numbers how they actually responded in terms of the number that's behind the percentage, and it'll be in a 1 or 2 page summary document, and I'll pass that along with my PowerPoint. And then in terms of how it compares, it really depends on the crowd. As I mentioned, in certain sectors like construction, I would say this is performing differently than that. I would say other groups that I've done, I've had a group with the St. Paul Chamber and some other chambers. I've also done a group in Wisconsin. I would say this is a little bit more reflective of what I'm seeing generally. The one thing I would say is the surveys that we've done, this is a larger group than I've seen. For the most part, what we've seen in our survey work is that the majority of firms who are cutting wages are not they're cutting by more than 10%. So I'm seeing a larger share here and a very small share here. That would be the main difference I see from my survey work.
Sure, there certainly are some groups that have remained fully open, some that have not opened at all yet, so there's quite a range.
Right. I think absolutely. So now I'm also curious about future wages. So what do you expect will happen to average wages at your firm from this point right now through the end of the year? Do you see a decrease by more than 25%, decrease between 10 and 25, a decrease of up to 10, flat or no change, or will wages increase, E, or don't know? Again, we really see wages. We try to follow wages because they can be a real leading indicator for what firms see in the future. And it looks like, I would say this is actually a little bit stronger than I've seen in some of the recent more general business surveys that I've taken. You know, with flat or no change, I typically see some that maybe are in this category. They may be in, in some more consumer-facing organizations that are seeing strong demand, like grocery stores. But overall, I would say this is maybe a similar to slightly smaller share than I've seen in some other surveys. So now I'd like to talk a little bit more about workforce and who's been affected. So the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development does a really nice job of offering data that help us know who's being laid off, or at least who's applying for unemployment benefits. And what the data show through March, through I believe the end of May, is that those that have been laid off are disproportionately less educated. Okay, so those that have a high school diploma or less, so you have two charts here. These are the aggregate numbers of people that have been laid off, or excuse me, that's not accurate. Those that have applied for unemployment insurance benefits. And this is the share of that group and the total share of the labor force for that group. So among the high schooler who have a high school diploma or less, over 40% of that group, of that labor force group, has applied for unemployment. Okay, and as you see, the more education you have, the smaller the share of that group that has been applying. Now, again, if you think about some of the sectors that have been most affected and their traditional workforce, firms like retail, food, beverage, some of those organizations are using, have more labor that fall into this skill group, and you're seeing a stronger effect as a result. Those that are affected by layoffs are also disproportionately female and minority workers. So here you have, again, the aggregate numbers, more females, more women than men. And in terms of minority, you see a smaller net population of minority workers that have filed for unemployment compared to the white population. However, when you go over here, you can see that the share of minority workers as a share of that labor force is significantly higher than the percentage of white workers that have filed for unemployment. Also, from a gender standpoint, more women than men as a share of that workforce have applied for unemployment. Doesn't mean that in terms of, if you go back to one of the earlier charts, it doesn't mean that that's how many are on unemployment. I don't actually have those figures. They don't break out acceptance rates. But again, just knowing that filing for unemployment means some level of separation, again, we have a lot of disparity here. I also looked at all of the minority groups, and what you find is that layoffs are disproportionate among all minority groups, but especially among Black and Native American workers. So here you have the aggregate numbers. It was easier from a listing standpoint to do it as a horizontal bar. Here you have non-white, non-Hispanic white, the very, very large majority of all layoffs. Okay, that's because the large majority of our workforce population is white. Okay, if you look at it from a proportion of that labor force, here you have non-Hispanic white, roughly 20%. For Blacks, roughly double the rate. So 4 out of 10 Black workers in the labor market have applied for unemployment insurance. Okay, Native Americans, 35%. And all of the groups have been higher than the non-Hispanic white. So, I think we kind of have to stop accepting these kinds of distributional effects when the economy goes into recession. This is a really difficult time right now. And we're not going to stop the economy from ever going into recession. But I do think we have the power that when it does, we have to start thinking about these distributional effects and how do we make them more evenly spread, particularly when it comes to minority workers and those who have faced disadvantages their whole work lives. These groups are more likely to have fewer resources to fall back on as a result, of some of the systemic things that have happened to them as workers. And I think we can do better, and we have to. Personally, I think it's not only the morally right thing to do, it's actually the sensible thing to do for the economy long term. In terms of really going back to pre-COVID, my main speech themes were about labor force and how do you take advantage of all workers. I think this just puts another angle on why we need to change things the way distributional effects are among groups.
And Ron, that unemployment breakdown was overall, there were no particular sectors. It was all sectors considered, right?
Correct. Correct. Okay, outlook. So I am interested in your outlook, and I'll give you a little idea of how the Minneapolis Fed is looking at this as well. So in the surveys that we did back in May, we asked about solvency. We wanted to know how long can your firm exist in this current really troublesome environment. And what I'm showing you here, I could have broken these down by any of the other firm traits that we talked about, but I decided to give it to you in terms of full-time employees, okay? And what we're looking at is kind of this, it's a arbitrary measure, but at 3 months is what we were interested in. And what you see is that the larger the firm, the more likely you were able to stay solvent past 3 months. The good news is that if you average these out, it's roughly about 1 in 4 firms cannot survive more than 3 months. The good news is that when we asked that question a month earlier, it was closer to 1 in 3. So it's an improvement. I would still say that there are many, many, many firms, thousands of firms that are on on the financial precipice. And I think that's what public policy is trying to solve. I think that's what the payroll protection program was attempting to help. I think we envision that program being hopefully getting us closer to some kind of strong recovery. I think the reason Congress is thinking about additional stimulus is I think it's pretty clear that maybe we're not there yet. So now I'm curious about what your outlook is. So we know that many firms are struggling in this environment. Could you tell me what your sales and revenue outlook is through the end of 2020? A, very pessimistic. B, somewhat pessimistic. C, flat or neutral. D, somewhat optimistic. E, very optimistic, or don't know. So it looks like it's leaning, unfortunately, too pessimistic, at least in the initial push of answers. You know, I think in many ways, what I hear repeatedly is simply the lack of visibility to the future. And from a business standpoint, I can't imagine the difficulty it is looking, to what lies ahead. Things have changed so dramatically just in 3 months. Here we are 3 months into the pandemic. I have to imagine businesses feel like it's been 3 years already. And to not have visibility and to be facing all of the restrictions and the requirements for cleanliness going back to the office, I understand why there is some pessimism, maybe some net pessimism going forward. I hope it changes, and I wish everyone luck on that. So now I just want to really quickly talk about what some of the new things that the Minneapolis Fed is doing going forward. As I mentioned, the real-time measuring the economy in real time is going to be of greater and greater importance. So we're moving more and more into that space. And what I wanted to let everyone know is that we've actually created a COVID dashboard. And if you go to minneapolisfed.org, you should be able to quickly find this dashboard. I'm just going to go over a couple of things that are on that dashboard. We're actually developing a lot more measures, but I'm just going to offer a few. And here what you see is a change in seated diners at restaurants. It's from a source called OpenTable. And basically here's pre-pandemic. And then with the shelter in place, you saw things literally fall to zero. We're really interested in what is going to happen to consumer demand going forward. We think this is really going to be a recovery that is dependent on consumer confidence. And so what we see is that we're starting, once restrictions were were lifted, they were lifted in the US a little bit earlier than lots of across the US, earlier than here. You see Wisconsin opened up a little bit earlier, saw it going roughly to trend with the US, and here you have Minnesota. So we're seeing some consumer activity come back. As you can see, PAR here, we have a long way to go, okay? For the Minneapolis Fed, the utility of this is that the data is only 4 days old. So this isn't perfect data by a long shot. It doesn't include a lot of areas, a lot of rural areas. But again, more data is better than less, which is what we were getting. So this, along with some other measures, we think are going to help us get a better picture in real time. We get auto traffic volume now from the DOT, particularly heavy truck traffic we were watching. That has actually stayed relatively on par over the last, especially the last 2 months or so after an initial decline. We also get TSA checkpoint travel numbers this is for the US. I actually get data for the largest 8 airports, including MSP in the 9th District. I can't show you that data because of confidentiality agreements. What I can tell you is it's showing almost exactly the same general trend in that it went to about 5% capacity and is now trickling up and is maybe at about between 80 and 85% of previous pre-COVID levels. But we get that data, sometimes I'd say a 4-day lag. That's what I have here. I've actually got it with as little as 1 or 2 days of lag. Then there's lots of good job sources out there, including Indeed. We're getting data from them on a regional level. So you can see, so we're getting a better picture of how different states who have different policies are performing in terms of what the job search looks like. As you know, everyone has a cell phone, and whether or not if you happen to allow yourself to be tracked, if you have lots of apps that track that stuff, that data is aggregated. And we're getting some of that to see how exactly people are moving around. And you're seeing that like in South Dakota, where there are fewer restrictions, their mobility has actually been increasing faster. Here you have Minneapolis down here starting to finally catch up with the US in general, and all the other states, again, improving, but not at a rate that we're hoping for. Google also has mobility data that we're looking at retail and recreation firms. And again, you're seeing kind of the same picture in terms of variation among states, and also with a much shorter time lag than a lot of the traditional data that we otherwise would be looking at. There are also better, at least some complementary employment figures that we look at, including this one from Homebase, which is showing us that, yes, again, job growth is coming back differently in different places. And we get that with only a 2-day lag. So it really does help us identify pivots if those things are happening. So looking ahead real quick, and this is just kind of a summary of what we've been talking about. Obviously, COVID-19 has had a huge impact everywhere. You didn't need me to come on today to this webinar to tell you that, but it has been impacting different firms in different places with different ownership structures differently. And that's really what I wanted to I think was the main message, is that this hasn't been equally destructive, but it has been destructive more so than anything we've experienced, at least in my lifetime. We don't expect a quick recovery short of some vaccine or breakthrough. And what we are expecting right now at the Minneapolis Fed, we're expecting more of a gradual recovery. And it's really going to be driven by consumer confidence and their balancing of this health pandemic with economic trends. People need money. People need jobs. Firms have to be open in order for their owners to make money, in order to employ workers. So there's this we know that there's this push-pull dynamic going on that we are trying to get a better handle of and trying to watch more closely. That's the end of my formal remarks. I am happy to stay here as long as viewers are interested to answer questions. Before we do that, I really just want to wish businesses luck. In this environment, I can't imagine how difficult it is to try to run a business knowing all the pressures that are there, all the volatility. I know running a business before COVID was tough. In this environment, it's got to be 10 times that. And I just wanted to wish all the attendees today luck in terms of running your business going forward. So I do want to ask for just a bit of feedback. It helps me get better. So while I maybe take questions, if you could provide me a little feedback, the answers will not display here. So I'll get that feedback after I get off this presentation. So Brent, if there are any questions, I'd love to take any.
Sounds good, Ron. First thing I wanted to follow up with you on, we kind of two questions that are maybe alternate sides of the same sort of idea. One is, we keep talking about this as being unprecedented, at least in our lifetime. As somebody who does a lot of analysis, are there any historical precedents that you're able to apply or that have been instructive for us now?
Yeah.
And then the other side of that, I know you're not completely in the projection game, but are there flexion points? Are there things, areas in the future that you mentioned, kind of the end of the PPP time, or certain other critical moments that we should be aware of down the road?
Right. So, in terms of historical precedent, the best thing that I've thought about that a bit, and the best comparison I can come up with is actually kind of combining several things, and that would be if you take the Great Recession with the immediacy and the shock of 9/11. I think you get into something that is maybe a little bit more close to this. If you were to go back to December, there was really a lot of optimism in the economy. Even going into January and February, you started to hear about COVID, but it really was, I think, just an absolute shock to everybody that when we had to go into shelter in place, and then all of the rolling effects of that. And so it's that immediacy that I think 9/11 kind of brought. Where your sense of safety and understanding the future maybe just was kind of put in shock. And then the Great Recession was just such a huge event that those two things. And then I think, if you were to also, I think now include in that some of the civil rights movement that was happening in the 60s, just this kind of social upheaval that you really have a lot of circumstances colliding right now that is really just unprecedented in my lifetime. And I'm not a good enough historian. I'm sure others could maybe put this in context better, but that's just kind of how I think about it right now. In terms of the inflection points, to me, I think some of the inflection, you mentioned one of them. I think as PPP loans are forgiven or essentially kind of taken off the books, and as you have the enhanced unemployment benefits expire, which will happen in July, I think we're probably at some inflection point then. And we're hoping that there's enough hiring going on that those people that are interested in jobs can go back. Something we're watching very closely. Firms have as they are labeled, most of the layoffs that have happened so far have technically been labeled temporary. I think we're fairly certain that the share of temporary and the share of permanent is going to move the wrong way to more permanent. We don't know what that share is, and I think we'll see some of that inflection when the unemployment enhanced benefits are going to happen. Some of the other things that I look at to bring in some of the construction stuff that I look at, one of the things I heard from the survey that I did, as well as some of the presentations I've given to that group, I'm hearing about a smaller pipeline, not as many requests for proposals in the fall. In that sector, short of potentially maybe a stimulus package or something, what I'm hearing from that sector is that they're not sure how busy they're going to be come fall. So I think every sector probably has different inflection points. I think the inflection point for the tourism industry is right now. As the economy is opening, how are consumers reacting? We are hearing about more activity up there. Will it be enough to carry them through? Again, many businesses, especially up in the northern part of the state, this is their hay time. And if they aren't able to make enough hay to last them through the winter, then I think we're also going to see some negative impacts there.
Great. I just wanted, I think, a final thought, and like I said, we're going to be making this presentation available so people can send it around and review it as needed. And you can see the contact information there. In particular, with engagement and outreach via the Federal Reserve for businesses that, what are resources or what are opportunities to connect that you would recommend? I know that right now businesses across the board have so many concerns, but in particular, what do you think are good ways that they can leverage the relationship with the Federal Reserve?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would refer you to our website, minneapolisfed.org. I think we have gone into the COVID space with both hands and both feet, whole body. There is a tremendous amount of research and data related to the current environment in any number of different areas. We have a research department, a center for opportunity inclusive growth that has been publishing papers and collecting more research on disparities and how COVID's affecting there. We're doing a lot of business surveys, as I've discussed. We're writing lots of articles and having other content that I think, if you're real, I know it's tough. I think everyone probably has COVID content overload. But again, if you're looking for what I'm a homer here, I'm gonna put us at the top of the food chain. If you're looking for objective research on what's happening in the economy and to different types of firms, people, populations, disparities, Minneapolis Fed's a great resource. MinneapolisFed.org is a great resource. In terms of the actual programs we're doing to help businesses, we do actually get requests like, does the Minneapolis Fed give individual business loans? No, unfortunately not. What we're there to do is to essentially backstop other organizations that actually do the loans themselves, with regards to the PPP loans and other things that we're involved with. So we're hoping that us acting as that larger player gives resources that are needed by lots and lots of businesses. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, it really did.